unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This morning at Carnegie, we had a visitor from New Delhi who stopped by for breakfast, except this was no ordinary visitor. Today we hosted India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar. Minister Jaishankar was in Washington for a host of official engagements on the heels of the Howdy Modi rally in Houston and last week's high-level week of the UN General Assembly. What follows is a condensed version of our breakfast meeting. Dr. Jaishankar is introduced by Carnegie President Bill Burns, and the conversation is moderated by my colleague Ashley Tellis. We bring you Dr. Jaishankar's introductory comments in full, but we've edited the Q&A to focus on what we think are the most interesting issues to Grand Tamasha listeners. The full audio and video of the event will be made available online. With that, here's Bill Burns kicking things off.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Carnegie Endowment. For those of you I don't know who don't know me, I'm Bill Burns, the president of the Carnegie Endowment. It's nice to see so many familiar faces here today. I really am delighted to be able to welcome back to Carnegie my friend and longtime colleague, Prime Minister Jaishankar. The truth is that I don't think I ever worked with a more capable professional diplomat than the minister, and I'm delighted that he's been able to make time in what I know is an extremely busy schedule, having survived the diplomatic speed dating of the United Nations General Assembly in New York last week, and now moving into what is familiar terrain for him in Washington, D.C., and which is today a nice, boring, controversy-free zone, to be able to offer his perspective, which is always an extremely thoughtful one, about the evolution of India's strategy on a very complicated international landscape, and then his thoughts on the U.S.-India strategic partnership, which, as all of you know, has deep roots across parties of both administrations over the last couple of decades, and always faces its share of both challenges and opportunities. And so after the minister makes a few opening comments, I'll turn to my friend and colleague Ashley Tellis to moderate the conversation after that.
Well, you know, this is very nostalgic, starting 8:30 in Washington at Carnegie Endowment. And I was trying to remember, I think the vivid memory I have is about 5.5 years ago. I had just come into Washington as ambassador. Those weren't exactly the best days for Indo-US relations. And I had an opportunity to speak. I think this was my first formal sort of stop where I spoke. I think actually you'd sort of remember that. And I thought to myself today how much those 5.5 years have changed. Changed us, changed the US, changed the world, changed our relationship in many years. So what I would do, if it's okay with all of you, is probably speak for about 10 minutes on, those changes, if you would. And then I'd really be much happier if I could respond to, your observations or your questions, so that I address your interests rather than hold forth on my own. So let me start at home, which is really Modi 2.0 in a way. And I think most of you would not dispute the fact that it was a very impressive election victory. But if we all are fair to ourselves, I think most of us would also admit that we didn't see that coming, certainly not on that scale. And to my mind, the reason is that, I saw two drivers of the verdict. One was a far more effective domestic delivery on many social welfare schemes and socio-economic interventions, and people sitting in far-off places, including Delhi, gave the government credit for. And I'd be honest with you, even I, now that I travel more within India, realize how effective and how penetrative those efforts were on the ground. The second, I think, was the national security sense that the world's a difficult place. Our region has been among the more difficult parts of a difficult world. And therefore, a sense that today you need a strong, safe pair of hands to guide national security. So actually, the interesting thing was that while a lot of people suggested anti-incumbency when the elections happened, in reality, you had a government and a prime minister who were still very much perceived as agents of change. What was the first vote in 2015 was a vote of hope. I think the second vote was much more a vote of trust. And it was reflected, interestingly, in actually more numbers. I mean, you had within one election about a 7% increase in the vote share, which is, if you ask any politician, that's not a mean achievement. You had 17 states where the BJP actually got more than 50% of the votes, which is in a Westminster model, a very, very strong statement of confidence. So the fact is that while there were a lot of challenges and clearly, the impact of many moves on society were visible, but it was clear that the electorate in many ways was probably more mature than people gave it credit for. And I say that because if you take the approach of the government in the last 5 years, and I would argue that this carries on, it was very much an approach of a long-term perspective, doing things which are possibly not immediately beneficial, taking tough calls where many of those calls have been ducked. And I think what you see now on 370, Article 370 and the legislative changes in Jammu and Kashmir is very much part of that kind of approach. So that's my sort of broad domestic sort of description for your consideration. So now let's look at the foreign policy. And again, let me speak to you about the last 5 years and then how we take it forward in the next 5. Some of you would remember a movie in the 1970s called Shatranj Ke Khiladi. It was a very famous Satyajit Ray movie, and for those of you who are not familiar, it's these two Indian Nawabs who are busy playing chess as the East India Company relentlessly kind of moves in on India. And the foreign policy takeaway for that is really Indian self-absorption, which leaves you oblivious really to larger global developments. And that's been very much, in a way, a challenge in a large argumentative society which mostly argues with itself. Now, the second sort of legacy, if you would, is really how non-alignment evolved in India, which was that what began really as a statement and a strategy of very fierce independence. Finally, as the world became more complex, it was more and more difficult to do a tightrope walking without offending anybody. So the policy which began really with the intention of maximizing your options ended up as a default position of saying the least and being the most cautious, which has its virtues at times, but often lets pass a lot of diplomatic opportunities. Now that, I think, both the awareness of the world and a willingness to engage and take risks and do things, I think both have changed very sharply. I mean, if you look at the last 5 years, there's been a very active, energetic engagement with actually every major power center. There's been a very vigorous effort made to cultivate constituencies, sometimes regional constituencies, sometimes larger developmental constituencies. But clearly a shift to a very activist diplomatic posture. It's also shown up in activities like HADR, where if you were to contrast what happened in 2004 tsunami, where much of the HADR relief efforts came from outside the region, increasingly, actually, India has become an HADR provider within the Indian Ocean region and sometimes beyond as well. It's shown up in sharper, I would say, conceptual communication. I mean, there is today a sharp sense of the neighborhood. When you keep saying neighborhood first, there is a message in it for all the neighbors. When it comes to ASEAN, the emphasis on the act versus the look, again, has a message of greater engagement. The Indian Ocean has a policy called Sagar, which again is a much more integrated, I mean, actually for the first time, an integrated Indian Ocean strategy from Australia to Madagascar. And the Indo-Pacific is, again, an example of a willingness to go beyond traditional silos and accept that the world today is much more seamless than it used to be. But it's not just in the strategic side. I think there is also a sense that, look, today we are the fifth largest economy, fifth, sixth, whatever, are likely to be the third pretty soon, clearly going to be the most populous country in the next few years. And somewhere our personality, our traditions, our heritage, our voice in many ways needs to be heard perhaps much more effectively than in the past. And there are a range of expressions to that. I mean, it could be the International Day of Yoga. It could be the fact that today speeches are given in our own language, conversations are in our own language. It could even be an event like many of you saw in Texas. So the point I'm making is you have a change in India, a generational change, a social change, a political change. You have a set of people who are really much more comfortable in their own skin and who are not today hesitant to engage the world on that basis. Now, looking at the world scenario, I think today we could argue over the reasons for why it is, but I think some of it is pretty obvious to all of us. I mean, clearly the era of benign globalization is over. But it is not to say globalization is over, because there are very deep structural bases for globalization. So you have, in a sense, a structural past contending with a much more nationalistic present. And that tension is playing out very differently in different parts of the world. It is also a fact that today alliances are diluting. So the post-45 world, I wouldn't say the post-45 world is coming to an end, but it is clearly, there is a kind of a transitional phase where the graph is pointing south there. There is an overall rebalancing in the world, economic rebalancing, political rebalancing. And when India looks at all of this, in an interesting way, we come at it from a slightly different direction than many other countries. I think today India is more nationalistic than it was before, but I would also assert India is more internationalist than it was before. And Indian nationalism is not contradictory to, I mean, there is actually an appetite for world affairs, which in many other nationalistic societies, it's much more sort of raising the walls and pulling back from where you are. And if I were to, I was sort of trying to find the right words to describe how we approach the world. I would say, in a way, with a high degree of realism, but with also a strong sense of beliefs. Now, in this sort of global background, let me say a few words about some of the major issues, and let me start with India-US relations. I mean, obviously, like every other country, we too are impacted by the repositioning of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world, the fact that it engages in a very different manner than it used to. And the point here is, in a sense, India has an advantage that not having inherited any of the alliance thinking, it's much easier for us to approach the United States as United States rather than the United States as part of as the center of a larger Western system. We, I think today, understand that this is a world of convergences, and you build your cooperation in your areas of convergence. And there are issues, there are even theaters. For example, we could have more convergence east of India than west of India, but there are probably very few places where there are no convergences, very few where there are full convergences. I think where the US, and this is my reading of a American intent, we've always, not always, at least for the last 20 years, seen a debate between those who have a global view and those who have a regional view. And I would argue that if you look back over the last 20 years, it's actually the globalists in the American system who have driven the change for stronger relations. And I think that duality of the United States continues to some extent. The 2-3 big issues which I think form the backbone of our relationship today, I think one is clearly the knowledge economy, and I see that getting stronger, not weaker. Clearly the direction of global economy, the direction of the American economy, the direction of the Indian one, all point towards much more focus on that set of businesses. The Diaspora Connect, I think, has also got stronger, partly due to numbers, but even more due to the quality of the diaspora. In a sense, today when we approach the relationship, it is very much, would it be a vision-driven progress, or would it be a transaction-driven progress? I think that is, and sometimes, by the way, the two go together. So I wouldn't do it as an either or. But I do think that I know in recent months there's been a lot of writing on the trade issues, but my sense of it is most of these are resolvable. In fact, my expectation is much of it is resolvable in the fairly near term. And I'm overall very confident about both the near-term future and the longer-term future of our relationship. If I could then shift gears and go on to Asia. In Asia, of course, the story of China's rise and how that impacts the rest of Asia, that is still playing out. For India as a neighbor with a somewhat complicated history, I think the search for us is for an equilibrium that would be satisfactory on both sides. It's not easy, an easy exercise, but to my mind, it is a very, very necessary exercise, because it's in the interest of neither country nor indeed the rest of the world that India-China relations are anything other than stable. We made some creative attempts at that. 2 years ago at Astana, there was a understanding, two conceptual understanding. One, that really our relation should be a factor of stability in an uncertain world, and two, that differences should not become disputes. And I must say, other than what happened at Doklam, which is now behind us, we have largely, both of us, lived up to that. And that moved on to Wuhan. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that, these are great problem-solving equations out there. What I am telling you is that India, today India and China have conversations at the leadership level with a degree of candor and an openness which they've not had for a very, very long time. And that, to my mind, has an enormous value, because when you're searching for an equilibrium, unless you have those conversations, you will not get to that equilibrium. So Wuhan for us was an exercise in that process, and obviously we hope to take that forward as more informal summits take place. The Japanese relationship is another important relationship. We've really come a very long way with Japan. We see Japan today economically active in India in a manner in which it has not been before. They've also brought to bear a much more strategic view of Asia and our part of Asia in particular. And we've expanded our relationship today to cover security issues, and those of you who have dealt with Japan would really understand, what it takes to actually get there. One word about the ASEAN. I think the ASEAN has actually been sort of the most acceptable platform in Asia, a place where actually much of Asia and a lot of non-Asia meet. And today, strengthening the cohesiveness of ASEAN and maintaining its centrality, these are very important objectives, not just for India, we believe for the larger region as well. Beyond Asia, of course, the two other big factors on our security calculations, one is Europe. Again, Europe has been very inward-looking, initially because of the Eurozone crisis, then the challenges that they faced out of North Africa, but then also due to Brexit. But Europe perhaps has not been, shall I say, as much on the change curve in terms of understanding the directions of the world than we would like it to be, particularly in respect to developments in our region. I think that too is changing. We see far more European interest now than we saw a year or 2 years ago. I think both the French and the Germans have been French particularly, have been very much more active out there. Where Russia is concerned, we've always maintained it has enormous geopolitical relevance for us. We have a very strong historical defense security relationship with that country, and that will continue. Overall, as I said, I paint to you a picture really of much greater strategic clarity in Delhi. Yes, I should add one more, which is we have begun, in a way, a much greater focus on Africa. It's interesting today, 5 years ago, we had 4 years ago at the India-Africa Summit, committed to $10 billion of lines of credit and $600 million of grant assistance to Africa. We are on track to actually deliver on that and perhaps exceed that in the 5-year period. We had also a training target of 50,000 for 5 years. We've actually done 40. We are opening 18 new embassies in the 3 years. All 18 are going to be in Africa. So out of 54 African countries, I think we'll end up, I forget, 46 or 48 of them. So to sum up, I think there'd be 2 points I would make for your consideration, which is that on the one hand, when we grow, we would like to grow with the world, both politically and economically. So while that may not be true of other parts of this globe, certainly in our case, the message would be of engagement and more engagement. And the second is, there will be a new balance in the making, which is natural. As any country, relatively and in absolute terms, goes up the ladder, the terms of transaction between that country, that society, and the world will obviously have to reflect that. So I think on a lot of issues, we certainly are clear that the decisions and the courses of action are going to be decided by us. Others can have their opinions on the matter. We would listen to it very respectfully. But at the end of the day, I think the changes which have happened in the last few years would reflect themselves in the manner in which we conduct our foreign policy and the manner in which we engage with other countries. So why don't I stop here and perhaps open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. It's wonderful to have you back here at Carnegie, and thank you for a wide-ranging set of remarks. I'm going to open the floor. Just two things to keep in mind. Use your 10 cards if you wish to be recognized, and identify yourself for the sake of the minister. And keep your interventions brief, because I want to get as many people involved in the conversation.
Sorry to jump back in, but at this point in the event, the speaker's microphone was not turned on, but the question was a really important one. The question posed by Sriram Lakshman of The Hindu picked up on something the minister said earlier when he remarked, quote, "Somewhere our personality, our traditions, our heritage, our voice, in many ways need to be heard, perhaps much more effectively than in the past." In his question, Sriram asked the minister, but whose personality, whose tradition, whose heritage, and whose voice within a very diverse Indian society gets highlighted? Here's the minister's response.
Look, I mean, nobody disputes that India is a pluralistic society and a pluralistic polity, and in many ways a pluralistic personality. By the way, when I'm talking personality, I'm talking national personality, not a person's personality. Now, because you have multiple voices and different facets, doesn't mean that none of them should be projected. The challenge for us is really, I mean, if nobody looks askance at the fact that today the Chinese or the Japanese or the Russians or the Arabs speak in their own language. I'm just using language as an example. So I don't think we need to be defensive or defensive on one side or chauvinistic on the other side about the use of our own metaphors, language, concepts, etc. The larger point I'm making is that if we believe today that we count more, and we count more economically, we count more strategically, we count more politically in terms of activity, that must be reflected in a fairer share of the conversation and a fairer share of the ideas of that conversation. And the examples I cited were to make that point. Certainly, I would say, and the paradox is you and I are having this conversation in English. We could have it in Tamil or in Hindi. But the fact is that it is, I think, natural today for a country in the position in which India is to articulate its ideas, use its metaphors, its language, both literally and conceptually, and introduce those into the international discourse. The idea that our, shall I say, thinking is shaped from the brainwork of other societies, to me, defeats common sense. Certainly at a time when I feel that I am able to pull my own weight so much more effectively than in the past. So I would urge you to look at this not so much in terms of India's domestic discourse, and that domestic discourse will be there in different societies in different ways. I would like you to look at it as part of the rebalancing. Rebalancing is not just in GDP numbers, though the GDP numbers are important. It is also in terms of everything else you do in diplomacy, which gives you that sense that the world is today a much more commonly owned, commonly led sort of enterprise.
So, Minister, prominent media outlets sort of in the US, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, have been fairly relentless critics of your government and the BJP and the Prime Minister. Why do you think it's the case? And do you think it sort of matters for you?
You know, there's a lot of change happening in India, there's a lot of change happening in the world. And in many ways, they kind of feed into each other. It's not that India is, today, everybody is on the same page and there are no arguments or disputes in India. It's also quite evident that in many ways a lot of our arguments within the country are reflected in global arguments of a different nature. So I take a lot of what are media comments and media analysis as reflecting the thinking, the viewpoints of different media organizations. When I'm at the negative end of it, I would regard it as a bias. Obviously, if it works in my favor, I'd say, insightful guys, they got it right. So now, I give you an example. Look at all that has come out on 370. Okay, it's almost impossible to find anywhere in global media one reference to the fact that 370 was a temporary provision of the Constitution, because it's inconvenient to the narrative which they are advancing. So let's not kid ourselves. The world is an ideological place. Okay, people. Not everybody is as fair, as objective as we would like them to be. Perhaps we ourselves are not. So I think it's, we take what comes from different quarters and then kind of assess, okay, who is saying that? So when you see who's saying it, you shrug your shoulders and you move on. So I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I think at the end of the day, certainly in a society like India, the caravan would move and people will do what they have to do.
Indo-US relations have taken a downturn after the previous two presidents. I mean, with the number of trade disputes, security issues that have come up, are much worse now. 3 years of this is over. The question is, there is talk about striking a deal with the USA on trade. And our fellows have felt we are under pressure. Do you settle now or say, why don't we hold out one more year just in case there is another president and then settle then? In other words, should we take a hard line on saying, we don't settle just because some time has passed. Let us wait. Maybe we have to deal with this guy anyway, but maybe there is somebody else.
Swami, your issue on trade disputes. Look, I have a larger concern, and the concern is this. In India, there is an inclination to put off decisions even otherwise. No longer. So I would, the moment somebody comes and says, look, why are you doing it now, push it off. No, I'm not saying timing doesn't matter. Okay, so I take that. I mean, in our business, in diplomacy, timing is very critical. But I would not, I would say, as a default position, kick my problems down the road, because then they tend to accumulate. And certainly on the trade side, we've seen that over many, many years, that, there are issues, which I remember from 20 years, which are still being debated in many ways. So maybe it's just me, but I would certainly advocate that if we have issues, I would like to engage, I would like to sort them out. I would not like to hold on to them and say maybe the world will be better tomorrow. Because my own sense is a year down the road, there'll be more issues. There'll be things we haven't foreseen today. So I would very much, and I think we have a backlog to deal with as well. I mean, there are legacy issues. There are issues we've been debating for the last few years. So I wouldn't, my inclination would be contrary to what you are saying, that irrespective of what happens in the American elections, I feel if there are issues which can be settled today, I would rather settle them today.
I wanted to ask you a question on Jammu and Kashmir, which I'm surprised didn't come up until you yourself brought it up. It's been about 60 days since the abrogation of 370, and the government is on record as basically laying out three objectives. One is to create a new political leadership that is aligned with the so-called sort of idea of India. The second is to create a vibrant economy that delivers for the local population, and to do so in a way that is consistent with, the rule of law, providing security and stability. I wonder if you could give us a roadmap about how we get from where we are today to how we get to those three desired end states.
Look, I would, first of all, differ with what you said in terms of our objectives. I don't think the objective is to promote a political leadership, because I think the leadership of any state or set of states would come from the leadership. So it's not that Delhi is going to say, well, these are the guys we like or not like. But I'll tell you what are the, in a sense, the objectives, or I'll give you sort of a broad explanation. Look at where we were on August 5th. Okay. After 70 years, after the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, and about 30 years of what has been a fairly high-intensity cross-border terrorism waged, which has disrupted pretty much the fabric of the state. There were limits to how much you could progress out there, because particularly the last few years, you had a lot of new elements to the challenges out there, including the emergence of much more radical fundamentalist ideologies and people bearing weapons in that name. You also had actually a social and if I were to give you a little history here, it's very interesting. Just so that I have you all on the same page. Article 370, the temporary Article 370, provided for the issue of presidential proclamations by which national laws then became applicable to the state. Now, over a period of time, initially the 1950s and 60s saw a very large number of these. These started trailing off. Now, if you were to actually do a correlation, you do a correlation between the alignment of Jammu and Kashmir to the national laws of India and the terrorism and the law and order status of Jammu and Kashmir, I would suggest to you, you'll find a very, very strong correlation out there. So the problem was that you had a state which actually, as India progressed, was was less and less aligned with India in every sense of the term. I mean, some of it could have been political, institutional, and administrative, but a lot of it was social and economic as well. I mean, as people know, a lot of the right to work, the right to information, the right to education, the reservations, these things, none of these provisions applied to Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, if you looked at the representative sample of any legislation which was passed by the parliament, fairly high up, page 1, maybe para 2 or para 3 you would have, but this law applies to all of India except to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So I would surely, from a common sense point of view, if you are, in a day and age where every society is undergoing change, hopefully for the better, the idea that one state remains unaligned, that every time it has to do its own thing, which it didn't do a lot of it. I mean, if they were doing it on their own and keeping in step, it was a different matter. But you look pretty much at anything progressive, anything to do with women, anything to do with children, anything to do with property, anything to do with affirmative action. I mean, in fact, the irony, Devesh, is everything which the liberal press thinks is good for the world was not happening in Jammu and Kashmir. And yet people wanted to defend the provision which was blocking that good from happening. I mean, look at the absurdity of it. So the point is that there is a fundamental issue of governance in a way at stake here. How long do you continue what was meant? I mean, and a fair reading of the Constituent Assembly debates. I mean, nobody has to take my word or that of the government. I mean, these are today all available on the net. Read the Constituent Assembly debates. Look at the correspondence of that era. Look how much even the temporary, the original draft of 370 was 306A. But 306A was initially much more ambitious than what 370 happened to be. So there was a trade-off at that time, saying, okay, we'll accept a more limited alignment, but it will be temporary, and over a period of time we will align. Now, we have moved away from that. And I don't want to cast aspersions on people, but we all know why that happened. There were considerations of various kinds at play. So today, I think somebody had to take a call, saying, enough of this, and let's find a more, a bolder. I accept. It's not without its risks, but the goal is towards de-radicalized Jammu and Kashmir rather than a more radicalized Jammu and Kashmir, and I think those were our options.
You mentioned that the era of benign globalization is ending, and you also talked a bit about the importance of your relationship with the Americans. So I guess my question is, given that the Trump administration is very much leading this change of globalization, arguably deglobalization, and takes a very sort of transactional, bilateral view of foreign affairs, to what extent does the character of globalization, the character of relations between countries, come into your conversation with the Trump administration? Because I presume from your wording, benign is over, that you saw it as benign. There are some good things about the kind of globalization that is receding.
No, my use of the word benign was that it was viewed benignly, rather than is globalization benign or not benign. By the way, I don't think globalization is malign. Okay, so let me be on record out there. So, in fact, my own sense is globalization is there to stay. You can modulate it, you can alter it here and there, but fundamentally the idea that in this day and age economies would be primarily national, I think is a very, very, or mobility should not be allowed, or that interpenetration of economies can be controlled. All those, I think there are realities out there. But the point I was making was, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even argued over this point, because everybody more or less accepted this is the direction the world is moving. Today we are arguing over that point. And whichever side of the argument I am on, I cannot be in denial of the fact that there is an argument, and I have to factor it into my calculations.
I hope we will have an opportunity to welcome you back. So on behalf of all of you, I want to thank you, Minister Jaishankar, for coming here. And I want to thank you all for coming relatively early in the morning. So thank you all very much. Take care.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.